Order, order. Welcome to this meeting of the Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee. We're joined by David Kogan, OBE, who is the government's preferred candidate for the chair of the new Independent Football Regulator established by the Football Governance Bill, which is currently going through the House of Commons. So very warm welcome to you, Mr Kogan. Fittingly, we have 90 minutes for this match. I'm afraid there won't be a half-time break and there won't be any swapping ends at half-time. So can I encourage you to keep your answers quite brief, because we have got quite a lot to get through. Everyone's got burning questions for you, but as is the chair's privilege, I'm going to kick us off. I'm afraid I'm going to be littering this today with football puns. I do apologise. Can you start us from the beginning? The sort of choreography of how you applied, why you applied, and how you went through the process of becoming the preferred candidate.
Yes, I'm very, very pleased to do so, and I'm delighted to be able to put on the public record the story of my candidacy, because obviously I've not been able to comment on it until this point. Before I get into the purpose of football, I think it's just worth saying that this is not my first public appointment. I was on the board of the Foreign Office Trading Fund for 8 years, appointed by a minister both under Labour and Conservative ministers. I was chairman of a further education college, very close to here in Vincent Square, working with Labour and Conservative ministers. And 3 years ago, I was appointed by Mrs Doris, a Conservative Secretary of State, to be on the board of Channel 4. So I had been through public appointments processes before under both parties. And when in April of last year, DCMS advertised for the post of chair, I didn't apply. And on May the 16th last year, which was the day applications closed, I received a phone call from the permanent secretary of the department asking me why I hadn't applied. And the reason she was phoning me, apparently, was that a number of candidates they'd approached, or putative candidates, had said that they thought I would be a better candidate. And the reason I hadn't applied was that I had 2 books written on the Labour Party. I was on the board of Labour List, and I'd also, both of which, by the way, had already happened when Mrs Doris appointed me to Channel 4, so I was known to have had that background. But in the intervening period, I'd also given money as a donor to a number of parliamentary candidates. And I said to the permanent secretary, I'm not entirely sure that a Conservative government would necessarily welcome my candidacy. She said, actually, your professional background is such that we think we'd like you to be a candidate, but I will go and check. And she went away, and at 10 o'clock that night called me again and said, you are clear to run. I don't know who she talked to, but I had been given absolute clearance as a candidate, rather admirably actually, by the government to run. And so they reopened applications for me. I duly applied that weekend and then flew off to America to what I thought was going to be the big political event of the following week, which was the Trump-Biden debate for my client CNN. Little did I know that Mr Sunak was going to call the election the following Wednesday, and this whole process went into abeyance. So there was then a suspension of this process over the course of the following months, an interminable wait. And it got to the autumn, and I was still nominally a candidate. I'd heard very little from the department in that period. And a number of things happened. The first in my own professional life was that the presidential election was taking place, and I was spending a lot of time in America. The second was that another client of mine is the New York Times. I'm heavily embedded in the issues of AI and copyright in America, which I've been taking a lot of time to do in America. And the third was that I was negotiating on behalf of the Women's Super League their media rights deals, and had been heavily immersed in trying to create a future for the Women's Super League after the 3 o'clock block slot had been denied to us, as Dr. Hutt might remember, because she asked the questions of both the Premier League and the EFL 14 months ago as to why that block had been slot. So I'd been heavily involved in all these other issues. And there was also a lot of noise going around about Labour donors, as you might recall. Not about the sort of donor I was, donor to local parliamentary candidates, but different types of donations. And I decided that actually it had gone on too long, I was too busy, and I withdrew from the process. That was last autumn. In March of this year, the permanent secretary called me for the second time in my life, this time under a Labour government, and asked me whether I was prepared to be a candidate again. And this time, the election was over in America, AI was continuing, obviously the Women's Super League deals had been done, I was much more free, but also I was much more interested in the job because the job, as time has gone by, the job has become more pressing and more important to the world of football. So I said I was available, and I then had to go through, and was happy to go through, the full process as other candidates had done earlier in the year. And the panel that was interviewing those candidates, whenever they were interviewing them, then was reconvened to interview me, and I became the preferred candidate, and I sit in front of you now today.
So you hadn't gone through any of the interview process, just to be clear, you hadn't gone through any of the interview process early on the first time of applying?
No, because the process has been suspended originally by the election being called, and then I withdrew before. I don't actually know when the other interviews took place, but it was already 6 months after I originally applied, which for me was rather too long.
You don't strike me, I've never met you before, but you don't strike me as the sort of person who does things just because someone asks you to or tells you to. So what made you want to apply for this?
Well, let's be clear about the importance of this role and the importance of the role of football. Since I first was involved in football since 1999, and I'm very happy to talk about my professional background in football, which is extensive, football has gone from being an important part of this country's culture to a critical part of this country's culture. And it works on a whole series of levels. It works on the level of sporting competition. It works as a series of business levels and remarkably has grown and developed as a business. I mean, one of the interesting things about League One last weekend was of the 6 teams that are now both being promoted and qualifying for the playoffs, 5 of them are now owned by very vigorous overseas owners. That would have been inconceivable 20 years ago. So football itself as a business is radically changing. But also, football as a community and as a part of a town's soul has become almost more important. And when we look at clubs such as Southend, which has been through 18 HMRC winding up petitions and survived them, when we look at what happened to Bury, I think the job is incredibly important, and I think I'm qualified to do it. So I'm not, as you so rightly say, somebody who's prone to being asked to do things and being ordered to do things. I'm highly independent. But I do believe that actually it's a really important job, and I think the regulator is an extraordinarily important institution that has got to be, to quote yourself, Chair, up and running and really addressing the issues pretty quickly.
What makes you the best person for this job?
I spent 26 years working in the world of football. I've worked for the Premier League, I've worked for the Football League, I've worked for the Scottish Premier League, I've worked for UEFA, and I spent the last 6 years working for the Women's Super League. So I don't think many people in the world of football have got all those points of the compass. I understand football finance. I understand, as much as anybody can understand, the politics of football, which change all the time. I am resilient. I also come from an extremely detailed background in corporate governance. I mean, it's part of my biography that you might not have picked up on. I've been on public boards, I've chaired public boards, I've chaired private companies, and I got a very extensive business background, which includes setting up companies, and I understand how startups work. And when you marry those different skills, the one thing I don't have is any background in regulation, but we can talk about that. I think those skills are necessary, and I think make me a viable candidate, if not the best candidate.
And in some ways, this whole need for a regulator has obviously grown out of Tracy Crouch's fan-led review, which was driven by fans and by the fact that fans had been excluded in so many cases from decisions, like really important decisions about the club and their clubs, the way that their club's heritage has been treated. Why would you say, from a fan's perspective, that you're the best person for this job?
I've spoken to Dame Tracy twice in the last 2 weeks, once verbally and once on WhatsApp, and had lengthy conversations with her about the fan-led review, which obviously was published in November 21. I mean, it feels like a sort of age away, really. And I've also had lengthy discussions with Kevin Miles, who I sat next to during the parliamentary debate last Monday, which was pleasant for both of us. And I really do think that the tenets of her report, of the Crouch report, which of course he was deputy chair, stand out even more now than they did then. Within this bill, there are considerable regulations and considerable provisions made for fans to engage with their clubs. And the reason that that is critical not just in terms of understanding the kind of financing of a club or the nature of an ownership of the club, is without the fans, the clubs don't exist, number one. But more importantly, the fans act as a firewall and a brake on what owners are doing and on understanding the future. And actually, if you're going to regulate, if you're going to have an understanding of the future of football, if you're going to have an understanding of where the clubs and the spirit of the clubs are going to go, you have to have the fans involved. And though I've never worked in fans organisations, I actually, as a fan myself, but more than that, as somebody who understands the nature of where this all came from, will believe that fans are going to be absolutely critical to the future of this, as indeed will the whole pyramid. This is not a regulator just of the Premier League. This is a regulator that's there to work with and protect 116 clubs. And all 116 of those clubs have fans who are embedded in their heart and soul.
Which club do you support?
Tottenham. Sorry.
That will endear you with Dame Tracy.
Yes, I seem to run into nothing but Arsenal fans these days, but I have been a Tottenham fan since 1964. I was at the FA Cup final, the Frank Saul final of 1967. When we look at issues of people suffering from mental injury when they were players in the 60s and 70s, and I'm of an age of that generation, I think of Mike England as a great Tottenham centre-half, and the way they were heading the ball, he's the image I have coming into my mind.
So I guess the thing that is still puzzling me a little bit is why you want to put yourself through this. I mean, this role is often described as a poison chalice, right? You've got there's already a cohort of people who are willing you to fail, not you specifically, but this whole organisation to fail because they didn't want it in the first place. There are others who see you and the Football Governance Bill as the silver bullet for all the ills that have impacted football over recent decades. Why on earth would someone like you want to put yourself through that? You don't need this in your life. Why do you want to do it?
I mean, it's a very good question, and one I have to say that my wife has been levelling at me for the last 3 weeks. And let me answer that by saying there's a sort of professional answer to that question, there's a personal answer to that question. Let's deal with the professional answer first. Yes, I'm fully aware there are people who don't want this regulator to succeed, don't want it to exist. And actually, I think that noise, and there's been an enormous amount of noise around this because it has gone on for so long, that noise I really do believe will recede from the Premier League and from others once the regulators are actually up and running. So I actually think the route to get to the regulator is we turn out in a year from now, we'll be able to judge it. It might actually be more difficult than actually the regulator itself. So that's the first thing. I live with confidence that the world of football, and indeed in the world of politics, people will come behind the regulator once it exists and once it sees we're doing our job properly. From a personal position, I have a professional career going back for 46 years now that has been filled with complexity and difficulty. I am hired professionally to do pretty difficult jobs that rely on high levels of pressure, high level of analysis, high level of strategy is what I do professionally. Actually, all of those things, I think, tie into this role as well. But I really want to do it because actually I really do think that at my somewhat advanced age now and my levels of experience, I can give the regulator elements that it needs to actually do the job properly. And I am ambitious and I'm interested and I'm hungry and I believe in football. And having spent 26 years benefiting from having worked in football, I've been in football, but not of football. I've never worked for a football organisation. I've been hired by them. I think the time has come now to use those skills and knowledge to the benefit of football, but also, frankly, to the benefit of myself, because I actually think this is an absolutely critical and fascinating job. And at my age, it's not often you get offered jobs like that.
You have operated at a very high level across football, but not in particularly high profile. So how will you deal with the inevitable media attention that will come with this job?
Well, I don't know. You may have heard me being on the Today programme repeatedly over the last 3 years talking about these very issues. I'm their sort of go-to guy. I do an enormous amount of media. I've done media about politics, obviously having written books about politics, and I've done quite a lot of media about football. And I'm very used to having come out of the media industry, being on the media and dealing with the media. And I don't have any concerns about that whatsoever. being in the public domain, being on public platforms, being held to account by you, I think is actually a necessary part of the job, and one that I won't say comfortable doing. How could anybody be comfortable? But I do feel that I am perfectly professionally capable of doing so, and I think I have a long track record of appearing on public platforms and in media and being able to handle that. So I don't have concerns.
There's a big difference, isn't there? There's a big difference between popping up on the Today programme from time to time and the kind of in-depth media intrusion in your life that potentially, and social media intrusion in your life that potentially could come with such a high profile and contentious job. Are you really ready for that?
Yeah, I really am. And actually, when it comes to social media, as it happens, I'm not on any social media, so whatever social media has been saying over the last 3 weeks, I actually haven't read. I'm quite immune to that sort of pressure. But in terms of intrusion, in terms of interest in what I'm doing, in terms of being any sort of public figure, in as much as the chair of the football regulator will be a public figure, I'm perfectly prepared to ride whatever that means. And I actually think that what people will be focusing on is the work of regulation. You have to remember that I'm a part-time chair. I'm not the executive chair. There will be a chief executive of this institution once we get round to appointing one, and there will be a board of this institution, and there may well be advisory committees, including people like fans also. There's going to be a lot of people involved in this. There are a vast number of stakeholders, and to refer to something you mentioned earlier, the levels of expectation around the regulator, which actually is an issue that concerns me, about both mission creep on the one hand and expectation on the other, is something that we're going to have to manage and mitigate pretty early. But actually, I have no personal concerns about being in that kind of public eye.
So, over the last few days, the last week or so, since we knew that you were the government's preferred candidate, a number of people have approached me with their opinions on you. Unrequested on my behalf, but people come up to me at social events, and the thing that comes back time and time again is he's a great guy, but he's not a regulator. And you say this yourself, you've never been a regulator. How credible is it that the person in charge of establishing and leading a new regulator has no regulatory experience?
Well, I don't know about the great guy, but thank you. And I think as far as being a regulator is concerned, I've never been a regulator. I've been subject to regulation. I've been on the other end of regulators. And also, just to go back to one thing I said earlier, I'm involved in extraordinarily complex stuff over AI and intellectual property in America, which comes very close to actually, in many cases, legally to points of regulation. But I'm not being a regulator. But as I said, we have a chair that may bring some series of skills. We also have a board to appoint. There is apparently a long list of candidates for the board. I don't know who's on that. I haven't been privy to that list. We also have a chief executive to appoint who clearly needs to bring in a whole series of skills that I don't have, including a background in regulation. And I'm told that within the shadow regulator itself, there are already people who have been appointed who come from a regulatory background. And what it seems to me the world of football requires, what you require, is a balance within the organisation between skills that are about regulation, knowledge of football, knowledge of the way in which the regulator is going to develop with all the tasks that are laid out in this document. And this document is very precise about the tasks the regulator has to carry out, and I hope we have the chance to talk about some of those in the course of this discussion. So I think, though I may not be a regulator, I am a leader of teams. I have created businesses. I know how to put together teams of very disparate skills. And I'm used to dealing with pressure in all sorts of ways. So though I may be not a regulator, I may not even be a great guy. What I am is somebody who's extremely battle-hardened in creating organisations that work and work to last. And to do that, you have to bring in a marriage of skills. And obviously, a large part of those skills will be from a regulatory background.
Okay, so let's talk about the practicals of this. What role will you now play if you take on this role in appointing the CEO and appointing the board and choosing who it's going to be? How will you bring that expertise together?
An extremely active role in both. As I said, just talking about the board, my understanding is there are 7 board places. The panel, I assume it was the same panel who interviewed me and the other candidates for chair, but I'm not absolutely sure. There has been a panel set of interviews of candidates, and there is a list. As I say, I don't know who's on that list. And obviously, I would have the ability to bring other people onto the list if I think there are skill gaps that we need to fill. As far as the Chief Executive is concerned, I mean, part of the concern I have about all of this is just how much time we have to do everything we've got to do. Appointing a CEO and getting whoever it is to in place on whatever notice periods they may be, wherever they be, is going to be a job that may take some time. I will be highly active in that recruitment process. Clearly, the board ultimately has to be approved by the Secretary of State. The CEO is appointed by the board then and by me. That will all happen. So the sequencing, I think, will be we'll appoint a board, do a search simultaneously for CEO, and appoint as quickly as possible so that you aren't just having to endure me in subsequent examinations of the regulator. There will be a highly skilled and talented team as well.
So what sort of timescales are we looking at here?
Until I'm in place, you have to understand, Chair, and the committee, I don't know what the budgets are for the regulator. I don't know what the staffing is for the regulator. I haven't seen an organogram for the regulator, and I don't know what provision has been made to do fast recruitment. I hope I do give you the impression that patience is not one of my great human qualities, and I am extremely impatient to get in there and make appointments and move as quickly as possible, because if we don't do so, all the consequential effects within this about the work we then have to do will slow up. So I want to get moving on this as fast as I can, but clearly that's subject to whatever views you have of me as a consequence of this meeting.
Which other regulators are you going to be looking at and taking lessons from? Who will you model yourself on as a football regulator?
Well, by a happy or unhappy coincidence, I have been appointed by Lord Grade, Conservative peer, who's chair of Ofcom, to be on the panel for the Channel 4 chair, which actually meets tomorrow, funnily enough. So I've already advanced to Ofcom, which seems to me a sort of relevant organisation, and also I think in terms of when it was first created, quite a recent regulator in the last 20 years or so. I have asked Lord Grade and the Chief Executive of Ofcom when I can meet them and get deep briefings about the lessons they have learned and what they've been able to do. But actually, as I say, when we start the recruitment process, and I understand already within the regulator there are one or two people with regulatory experience, I'd expect to talk to as many regulators as possible. And in one sense, one needs to bring in the information and the fact-finding about how regulators operate, but also within the bill, when we look at licensing regime, when we look at fan engagement, when we look at the state of the game report, all of these things that we have to do, it's pretty prescriptive and pretty clear about the work we need to carry out. So I think it's a mixture of learning about how other regulators operate while simultaneously appointing people to do it, while equally simultaneously starting to carry out the work.
Meet with Ofcom, you might want to suggest to them that we'd prefer it if they did have an opinion on whether the Department for Culture, Media and Sport should be eliminated. We met with them yesterday, and they were sort of fairly ambivalent about the entire future of the department.
I'm afraid I hardly think you need me to deliver messages for you, but also I wouldn't dare involved in that issue.
Okay, I'm going to be quiet for a second and pass you on to Paul.
Thank you, Chair. And I refer the committee to my register of interest, where I'm a member of the Dale Trust, which is Rochdale Supporters Trust. I'm a lifelong Rochdale fan and season ticket holder. You say, David, your priorities for your first year will be rooted in the right decision taken early about people, budget and outreach. What does the right decision mean to you?
Well, I think the right decision, Mr. Waugh, is decisions that actually have a direct effect on action. I mean, I think actually what the regulator has to be is highly proactive. We need to be extremely goal-focused and actually doing the things we say we're going to do. And I also have quite a strong view actually on how the regulator should be working with clubs such as Rochdale. I mean, one of the things that one has seen as other regulators have operated in areas of sort of the arts is when you are a very small organisation with very few staff and you suddenly have a regulator bearing down on you, we talk about proportionality of budget, of the levy. Actually, I think proportionality of bureaucracy is another really big issue within the world of football. And I was talking to Mr. Pearce of the National League about this 2 days ago. So when we talk about the right decisions, I mean decisions that are actually going to be effective, that are going to have a direct impact on making sure that the very, very clear train lines that are set out in this bill are met. And as we go along, being able to demonstrate in a completely transparent way to you and to your constituents and to fellow members of the Supporters Trust of Rochdale Football Club, AFC, that we are doing the right job, and there will be bumps along the way, there always are, but actually I think a rigorous sense of achievement and delivery and transparency will be what I regard as the right set of decisions.
Well, you neatly preempted my questions about proportionality of both the levy and bureaucracy, but can I ask you a little bit more about the levy then? Do you expect the Premier League clubs will shoulder the vast majority of the cost of that levy?
Well, can I just say a couple of things about process around the levy, which I think might be helpful. As you'll be aware, at the moment, the department by the Treasury is paying for the costs of the shadow regulator. I actually don't know what those costs are. One of the things that's interesting about the levy is not only is the levy there about future monies for the regulator, it's also there to pay back the Treasury and government for the monies that have already been spent. Now, I have no idea what we're talking about there in terms of scale, because I don't know what the numbers are. But I actually do believe, and the proportionality is built into this, that you can't, and it's clear within the legislation, you can't actually get to the point of levy without having gone through the licensing regime. The levy is defined here as being levied on all 116 clubs, all 116 licensed clubs. You can't do the levy until you've done the licensing. So we're going to go through a process of 116 clubs being licensed under the football governance statement from the government and under the corporate governance statements of the regulator before we can even get to a point of the levy. Now, how we then decide to levy is a matter of both public negotiation, as you'll be aware. It all has to be done through public consultation, and it has to be proportionate, and it has to be sensible. And I do think that it's a bit early for me to answer the question of how we're going to do that, since we haven't even started licensing clubs yet. I've also no doubt that you and others will be, in the course of the next period of time as we're doing it, we'll be asking this question repeatedly, and the more evidence we get and the more knowledge we get, the more we'll be able to come up with a precise answer.
Well, the logic of you stressing the proportionality is that the Premier League clubs are disproportionately more wealthy, and therefore they will be paying more.
Well, it's not me who's stressing proportionality, it's actually the bill, as you know. It is an implicit and explicit within the bill. I suppose what you're really asking me is, do I agree with the premise of that? And the answer is, I do.
Yeah. And if the Premier League have any pushback to that, have you got any experience in trying to get people like that on board? Yeah,
I mean, I spent 26 years in football, both agreeing and disagreeing with people and getting people and negotiating. I mean, I am a negotiator by training and by trade, and I think that the Premier League, as I said earlier, and I've noticed recent statements in briefing notes that have been put out by the Premier League and its constituent clubs clearly have a view about the regulator and about regulation. And one of the things that's interesting actually about the Select Committee session in January 2024, in which Dr. Huck and the Chair were both I think now the only members who were on that committee, is when you watch it, which I did on Sunday for 2 hours, there are two things that really come out of it. And one is the statement by Richard Masters. This was in January of 2024, that it was the first and top priority of the Premier League to reach an agreement with the EFL on future financing of football. Well, here we still are. So I think actually, when it comes to the whole point, and you haven't asked about the backstop, but when it comes to the whole point about agreements within the world of football about the levy, when it comes to agreements between the various leagues in football, there has been a lot of thinking done about this. There's been a lot of talk about it, and nobody's been prepared to act because this has taken as long as it has. I think once the regulator exists, that changes that paradigm, and I look forward to those discussions, knowing all the individuals. I have the advantage of knowing Mr. Perry, I have the advantage of knowing Mr. Birch, Mr. Craig from the EFL, and I have the advantage of knowing Mr. Masters and his colleagues at the Premier League. I look forward to the discussions we're all going to have together, and I'm sure that rational thinking will pertain.
You've clearly done your homework, and you're a bit of a stato like any football fan. But are you concerned that some of these additional costs from the levy will be passed on to fans in any way by some clubs? That's a concern.
Well, I hope not, but because the levy, as I said earlier, the levy has actually got a number of potential components, and we don't know what they're going to be. I mean, there is obviously the cost of the regulator. There's obviously the historic costs that have already been spent. Don't know what those are. The regulator has been designed to be light touch, but actually more than that, it's been designed to be a relatively lightweight bureaucracy and a lightweight structure. We also don't know. I was very interested actually reading the FA's annual report recently, where one of the risks that the FA identifies is the rising tide of legal action and within the world of football. And obviously, every decision that is taken as a consequence of this bill by the regulator is going to have a multitude, no doubt, of potentially litigious clubs and lawyers looking at what we do. So we have to be absolutely watertight in what we do. But clearly, we may have to bear costs of legal actions that we can't forecast. So there are different elements here, some of which are actually potentially provoked by the world of football, that I hope we can mitigate before we actually run into those problems.
Can I ask you a little bit then further about the disproportionate compliance burden on smaller clubs, and you've referred to it already. National League clubs, you know, they're lucky they've got a handful of backroom staff who are not playing staff, and they're going to have to deal with this new regulator. Obviously, they've got concerns. I mean, will the regulator do anything at all to ensure that those clubs have support, maybe even financial support, to help cope with that burden?
I can't stress how delighted I am you've asked that question, because one of the things that I have said consistently in this process is not only do I want the burden of regulation on small clubs with few employees to be as minimal as possible, I actually want the regulator, I don't think they'd thought of this, to have a help desk built within it. Those of us who run businesses, you know, one of the things that I'm personally obsessed about is what used to be called the 3-ring rule. The 3-ring rule is when somebody phones your business and the phone isn't answered after 3 rings. These days, it's the 3-email rule. Somebody sends an email, gets no response for a week, drives me crazy. What I want this regulator to be able to do is have a help desk and have a ways whereby we're not seen as being a cop in the world of football, we're seen as being an asset to the world of football. So that when we're asking perfectly legitimate questions about 3-year business plans and financing and liquidity and the role of the owner, this is the burden that we will put on clubs in terms of licensing. At the same time, we're saying to clubs such as Rochdale, if you do not have the accounting practices that allow you to answer this, we will supply those to you. If you do not have an understanding of what we're trying to do, we will send a team to you. One of the interesting bits of journalism I picked up on when preparing for this role is a really interesting article about Lincoln City. A team from the Shadow Regulator went to Lincoln City 3 or 4 weeks ago to talk to them about how a regulator would work with Lincoln City. And it's very interesting that I think it's Mr Scully, who's German, talked about how refreshing it was that they had regulators there who are actually learning how a team like a club like Lincoln City could work with that regulator. Well, I think that is a model, in terms of outreach, in terms of consultation, but also a model about the way we should be working. I would hope in a year from now, you will all have stories about how the regulator has, instead of imposing itself on clubs, has actually assisted clubs to allow us to do our work properly. And of the 116 licenses, I'm hoping most of them will be extremely smooth.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Let's go on to Bio, please.
Thank you, David.
Morning.
You mentioned a couple of things earlier. You said politics, governance, commerce, in terms of how you look at the role and the responsibility in terms of sort of football governance. So my first question to you is sort of what measures will you be using to evaluate the success of the regulator, both in terms of the professional sort of appraisal, but also your personal view on how you feel success should look like?
I mean what I'm about to say is in an entirely serious way, but actually in one sense, the less you ever hear of the regulator, the better. In a strange way, a tribute to the success of any form of regulation is that it's actually pretty much invisible and pretty much inaudible. I mean, clearly, given the length of my answers, being inaudible is not one of my personal qualities, but hey. When we look at the various tasks that have to be carried out, and we go through them, the role of licensing, as I said in my answer to Mr Waugh, the role of licensing ought to be, I want it to be, seen as something that is of assistance to the world of football, because what it's testing is financial resilience and the ability of clubs to continue and not have the problems at Southend. And Southend, I think, is a real kind of story here of what we're trying to avoid over the course of the last 10 years. So first of all, licensing being relatively straightforward. I think the State of Game report, which you may be wishing to ask me about later, and I won't talk about it now, is a critical kind of manifesto for the regulator, and a critical piece of analysis that actually will give everybody a vision of where football is going and where it is today. And then we have the backstop. And actually, if you, again, I don't want to preempt any of your questions on this, but actually, the world of football needs to find its own solutions. And the regulator, though it has the authority to get involved in all sorts of ways, owners and directors tests and all sorts of other ways, the less it does, the better. What we want is the world of football to find its own solutions, and we're there to help get that. So the answer to your question really is, how do I judge success? I judge success by achieving the goals that are set out in this bill in a timely and effective way, but I also judge it by the regulator not having to use the powers it's got to intervene in ways that are difficult or problematic, because if we don't have to do that, it means that football has found its own solutions.
Okay, brilliant. The Chair mentioned the public scrutiny, and when I was asking you about the sort of three things of politics, of governance, commerce, community was something that I would have added onto that. And I say this because football is public property. You're talking about community assets. And so you're not going to be giving a lot of time in order to sort of get this role working in the way that you want in many respects, because of the public ownership of their football clubs and their community assets. So what I would say to you is, what do you think will be your biggest frustrations in the first sort of 18 months of the role?
Well, I think it's referring to an answer I gave, I think, to the Chair earlier. I mean, my frustration, maybe not so much my frustration, but my concern is the following. We saw in the debate in the House the other day, there is a huge amount of expectation about what the regulator might do, most of which is not, in fact, within the regulator's power to do it. So there is this burden of expectation that everybody's going to have, the build-up since the Crouch Report in 2021, of everyone assuming the regulator is going to be able to get involved in all sorts of issues. And when we don't, I think part of my concern is that we're going to have to handle in a public way why we haven't been able to do those. So that's the first bit. My second concern is resourcing and budget. And the reason I come back to this is the best way we can work with communities, the best way we can work with clubs is by being resourced effectively enough to be able to do the jobs quickly and effectively. And if we don't have those resources, if we don't have the resources to do what's laid out in the bill properly, things are going to stack up and get delayed, and no one will accept those excuses, and nor should they. So my frustration is actually more about our ability to do what we're being asked to do properly, and that allows us then the bandwidth to go to communities, to go to fan groups, to go to clubs, and actually work with them to find the right solutions. And that is, I think, a serious concern. And indeed, the fact that this process has taken as long as it has, I think, should be a concern to everybody. I mean, the deadlines aren't getting any longer, they're just getting shorter. And therefore, the need to hit the ground running, to quote something you said in the House the other day, I completely agree with, and it is my primary concern.
So the purpose of the Football Governance Bill, and I quote, is to protect and promote the sustainability of English football. We talk about community. I've been working with the club I represent, which is Southend United and the Shrimpers Trust, and they've done amazing work in trying to safeguard the future of the club. Now, what does sustainability mean to you?
Sustainability means a club that has the liquidity, has the financial resource, from wherever that financial resource may come, and perhaps I'll come back to that point in a second, it has the stability, and the key word here is stability, to see a future that is not prone to chaos and mismanagement, its assets being stripped, and its fans being denied, as fans in Bury were, as indeed fans in 60 clubs have been since 1990, being denied their ability to have their football club. And sustainability, to me, which is embedded actually in the bill, is critical alongside stability. And when I look on the positive side of this, as I said right at the start of this, when I look at the levels of international investment and domestic investment in clubs, which is spread throughout the pyramid and is reinforcing clubs and reinforcing the pyramid, I think actually there are very good and optimistic signs. But we all know there are signs where that hasn't happened, where that hasn't happened with owners, it hasn't happened in terms of actually the right management of the club as an asset. And I do believe that sustainability is about getting those basic things right. I mean, the old joke in football is, how do you make a small fortune in football? You start with a big one. Well, actually, how do you start with a club that survives? You can't just rely on people such as yourself and members of the Shrimpers Trust supporting a club. You've got to have ownership, you've got to have asset management, you've got to have a plan, you've got to have a vision. And I do believe that that's what the licensing regime is about and what sustainability will be about in the longer term.
Thank you. So you mentioned, and this is the only time I mention it, Spurs. You're a Spurs fan, so those words won't leave my lips again.
You are indeed a West Ham fan, I also understand.
I am, yes. So it's good.
A long line of West Ham fans.
Brilliant. So sustainability means something very different to a top six Premier League club, whereas the club I represent in Salford United is a Tier 5 club, and sustainability looks very different to them. And so my question is, do you feel you'll be able to empathise and have the right structures in place so that you can look at the governance of football, not just through the lens of a Premier League club, but also through a Tier 5 club such as Salford United or Rochdale?
Well, I absolutely do, and I hope you'll invite me to Southend and we can have this conversation directly with people who are now running the club. I mean, I actually think part of this job is to broaden my reach and my knowledge of clubs that I don't have particular knowledge of. 116 of them is going to involve quite a lot of travel, but there you go. But actually, to answer your point seriously, I mean, what we've seen in the last 26 years since I've been involved in football, and bear in mind, I spent 10 years working with the EFL. I spent 6 years working with the Scottish Premier League. I've actually spent 6 years working with the Women's Super League. So I have seen this from every conceivable angle in terms of size of clubs and sustainability of clubs and financing of clubs in a whole variety of different ways in football. And empathy, I actually think is an important issue here. I think you've got to have understanding, but I also think you've got to have the knowledge of when you need to be empathetic and when you need to be supportive, and that's indeed what the regulator will do. But to come to your point, what we've seen develop within the world of football are a series of cliff edges within the financing of it. We all know about the top 6 clubs within the Premier League. They're getting monies not only from the Premier League, but also from European competition. You've got that cliff edge between those, and there are other 14. You've got that cliff edge there between those and those clubs that have been promoted and then relegated, and parachute payment issues within the Championship. And then you've got the Championship and the rest of the clubs in the Championship, and those going down to leagues further down the league, further down the leagues and further down the pyramid. So what you have are a series of fiscal cliff edges, all of which have become sharper and more stark. But if you believe in the pyramid, if you believe that actually English football is all about that big base leading to the pinnacle, and that's what it's always been about, then you've got to believe that Southend has a right to be sustained and supported as much as West Ham, and even, dare I say it, as much as Spurs. You cannot go into the role of creating a regulator, and this is exactly what was implicit in the Crouch report, without not only understanding fans and communities, but understanding the base of the pyramid. It is indeed a pyramid, and it has to be regarded as such. Pyramids that start like that collapse. Pyramids that start like that survive. Our job is to help the pyramid survive.
Okay, thank you. And my last question, earlier you mentioned sort of mission creep and the expectation. So if a club files for bankruptcy, will you see that as a failure of the regulator?
If a club, having gone through the licensing regime where we have had our questions answered and we have financial information that indicates that there is potentially a problem, and we will be getting that financial information, we have, as you know, within the bill, the power to intervene and the power to get more information and the power to actually come to a clear view about the sustainability of that club. If we've gone through all those checks and balances, if we have gone through all those checks and balances about owners and directors, if we've gone through all those checks and balances and talking to the relevant league, and the club then still goes bankrupt, I'd say that the system that we have created has got a significant flaw in it. But we're starting from scratch. I mean, I would remind everybody, no one has done this before. There has been no football regulator anywhere in the world. We are starting entirely with a new entity, and it's going to take us time to build up there. So I think the question is a reasonable question. And what I'd like to do is give you a much more reasoned answer after we've been through a licensing regime with 116 clubs. But that licensing regime is the early warning system. It is the risk tripwire. And if that risk tripwire hasn't worked, then yes, I would say there is actually a problem in that risk system and we have to correct it.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks, Bai. Let's go to Liz.
Thank you, Chair. Mr Kogan, there has been widespread concern since the announcement of your appointment about your close ties to the Labour Party. What reassurances can you give this committee that the regulator will remain completely independent of government?
I'm very glad that question has been asked, and I'm glad to put it absolutely on the public record of my personal independence. My independence both of individual groups within football and my absolute independence of political control. I have been a donor to the Labour Party. I have been utterly transparent about it. In fact, I mean, I've been transparent to the point where things that have been written about me, that actually some have been accurate, some have been wholly inaccurate, but actually they haven't actually discovered all that I have done as a donor to the Labour Party. And I'm prepared to declare now on the public record that 5 years ago I contributed very small sums of money to both the leadership campaigns of the Labour Party of both Sir Keir Starmer and of Lisa Nandy. That hasn't been discovered by the press, so I'm happy to declare it now. But I did those donations, and I did those donations to individual parliamentary candidates, none of whom were MPs, in the belief that actually having a leadership battle within the Labour Party with two seasoned candidates was a good thing, not a bad thing, in the belief that you actually want to have good parliamentary candidates to fill good parliamentary seats. And I have never actually been particularly close to any of the individuals to whom I have donated money. So I have a total personal independence from all of them. I also think the regulator itself guarantees independence. I mean, you'll know that in Clause 11 of this bill, there is a football governance statement that has to be produced by the Secretary of State. That football governance statement determines the remit of the regulator and can't be revisited for 5 years unless there's a general election. I'm governed by that football governance statement, and I think there is no wiggle room for any politician who wishes to put me under any political pressure. I think, the chair referred earlier to my lack of regulatory experience, and people have a view of me. I think one thing she might have been too polite to point out is I'm pretty well noted, and this has come through quite a lot of the press reports, as my independent, slightly tricky character when people try to put pressure on me. I have been involved in many jobs involving significant levels of pressure, both as an international journalist running Reuters Television, running Magnum Photos, but also in terms of the commercial work that I do. I am not really susceptible to any pressure, including political pressure. And the so-called ties to the Labour Party are in fact far less than have been appeared in the public press.
Are you concerned that your appointment and perceived political bias will undermine the regulator before it's set up?
Well, I don't know who's perceiving that political bias, but no, I don't believe it will. I think it's obviously a judgment call that you will have to make rather than me, actually, in the consequence of this meeting. I hope that what I've demonstrated in this meeting is my own professional capabilities, my own interest in football, my own sense of where the regulator should be going, and the fact that there is now a need to get going with things. I don't believe that I have undermined that by my history of writing books about the Labour Party, being on the Labour List board and being a donor, but clearly that's a judgment call that others may need to make rather than myself.
Did you discuss your application with any members of the current government?
No. No, I mean, obviously I was first approached by the previous government.
You seem a little perturbed by or puzzled by the suggestion of political bias, Mr Kogan. I mean, you've written 2 books on the Labour Party. You've been chair of the Labour List. You've donated over £30,000 in the last few years to Labour candidates. I mean, you are effectively Labour Party aristocracy. So I think being accused of there being a perceived bias is not an unreasonable suggestion. So what I guess what I want to know is sort of like, pertinent to Liz's question, is that bias is out there. I mean, whether you like it or not, it's there. So what are you going to do to address it? How are you going to settle that down and make sure that from day one, as we talk about hitting the ground running, you do so getting rid of any of this allegations that you're in the pocket of the Prime Minister, that you're in cahoots with the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, and that somehow you're the puppet of the Labour government?
So if I appear to be puzzled or dismissive of your question, that was absolutely not my intention. Quite the contrary. I'm glad you asked it, and it has to be addressed. I completely accept that. I mean, just to be clear, I have never had a one-on-one meeting with Keir Starmer. I've never met Keir Starmer since he's become Prime Minister, literally, not been in a room with him. I met him a number of times. I don't know if this often happens when you mention the name of the Prime Minister, but Shall I continue? And
You carry on. It's just a
I
little
hope
musical accompaniment.
you can
that,
hear me. I don't quite know. Must be tractors, I suspect.
Sorry.
So I am not. I mean, I must say, I've never in my life been described as being aristocracy of any type, let alone Labour aristocracy. So I'm not quite entirely sure how to respond to that. But I recognise there is a perception, and let's be clear, it's not bias, it's a perception of bias. And the way that you correct a perception is by action and by delivery and by being transparent and by being held to account. All of those things I absolutely pledge to you I will be. I absolutely am happy to be accountable to all of you, to come back to this committee as frequently as you wish me to be. And if you see any sense of political prejudice coming through in any of the decisions I'm taking as chair of the regulatory authority, then I've no doubt they will be highlighted by you and by everybody else. But it's simply, I have to give you my personal assurance. It's really all I can do is give you a personal assurance. This will not happen. It would be you asked the question, why on earth do I want to do this job? Why on earth would I want to do this job if I thought that my life was going to be dogged by accusations of political bias and the actions carried out would reinforce that? It's the last thing in the world I'd want to do. I want to do this job properly, and I want to do this job effectively, and I want to be held to account while doing so, and I'm very happy to be held to that account.
And then in terms of operational independence from the sector itself, how will you set up and sustain the image and the reputation for that independence operationally from within the football sector?
Well, I have already had conversations with Mr Pearce of the National League. I've already talked to Kevin Miles of the Football Association, Football Support Association. My understanding is that Mr Parry has, from the EFL, and his colleagues at the EFL have given me support. They've certainly given it to me in private. I understand they may have done it in public. The Premier League have yet to make any comment. So actually, I don't think my previous relationships with any parts of football have been anything other than helpful in them understanding that I'm without any particular bias in any of their particular directions. It comes down to the questions you were asking about sustainability and about the pyramid. You have to basically be committed to 116 clubs. So I don't really think there is a perceived prejudice or bias that I've got in terms of the way football itself operates. Within the regulator itself, as I say, we have a lot of work to do on some very clear tram lines with some very clear deliverables in this, where objectivity and clarity and transparency and accountability are all going to be critical parts of our regulatory mission, and I'm absolutely committed to all of those, as well as deliverables.
Thank you. Let's move on to Tom, please.
Thank you. And before I start asking my questions, I should declare that I've once had dinner with Mr Kogan. Do you think that the role of the regulator is widely and accurately understood by all stakeholders?
By all stakeholders? I'm sorry, this is now getting quite noisy. Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said earlier, I think everybody, let's talk about who the stakeholders are, maybe. So there obviously the whole range of stakeholders within the world of football. Fans, clubs, leagues. There are also the stakeholders in the world of politics. There are also the stakeholders in the world of the public. There are also stakeholders in some ways in the world of media. I mean, there are countless stakeholders in this. And they all, I hope, if they've read the bill, if they understand what the bill is about, will have a clear sense of what the mission of the regulator is going to be. And my suspicion is that many people will want the regulator to do many things that are not within the bill, not within its mission. And that gets you into a debate about what in future the regulator should be. So I think there's a high level of understanding, but what I really think there is a high level of anticipation, because it's now been nearly 4 years and everybody is sort of sitting here waiting for this mythical creation to take place. I think stakeholders have a clear idea of why they want it. They may not have a clear idea of what it's going to do, but I hope we will be able to deliver that message quite quickly.
Thank you. And you said earlier, perhaps in your opening, that you believe that the noise from the Premier League and others might recede in time. How will you manage opposition and engender cooperation across all of football, particularly with those who are resistant to regulation?
I don't know about the noise from the Premier League. It would be nice if the noise from the tractors stopped. I think that there are always public pronouncements. The whole point about football, whole point about chairman in football and chief executives in football is everybody has an opinion about pretty much everything, pretty much all the time, in my personal experience of the world of football. And obviously one reads in lots of public commentary about lots of things. That is not the same as going through a mechanistic approach to the things we have to do that are laid out in the bill in a very precise way on the one hand, and private conversations and private discussions and private negotiations about the future of football. And this obviously leads us into a direct discussion of the fact that the Premier League and the EFL have spent now, since 2019 was the last time they did a deal about future football finance. It's 2019. A year and a half ago, as I said, the select committee there, it appeared that the Premier League and the EFL were on the point of doing a deal. Actually, if you listen to that debate, there's a lot of detail that came through about where they had got to, and here we are, 16 months later, and nothing has happened, and the regulator is about to be created. So I actually suspect that within the private rooms of clubs and within the private rooms of the Premier League, there is a more active discussion going on. I see the Premier League has now appointed an executive with a very large budget to deal directly with regulation. I like to take that as a positive step rather than one where they're necessarily fighting everything we're going to do. But until we are created, until I'm in post, we need to test it.
On the topic of fighting you might do you anticipate many legal challenges to the regulator, and how would you manage them?
I would absolutely hope not. But as I said earlier, you have to prepare for the worst. Prepare for the worst in this instance will be there are very wealthy clubs and there's a very wealthy league. The regulator has to be geared up for legal challenge, and the way it does that is by doing its work properly and going through the full accountability process, by being as watertight as it can about what it's seeking to do. And then if you get legal challenge, you have to have the financing to be able to meet that legal challenge.
Beyond legal challenges, are there any worries you have about taking the job?
No, actually, possibly it's the perverse nature of my personality. The more I have been through the experience of the last 2 or 3 weeks, and particularly sitting for 5 hours in the debate the other day as I did, the more I believe that you have to accept in public life and in public posts a certain degree of pressure. And actually, the more I've been involved in it, the more work I've done on preparing for it, the more committed I am to doing it.
Thanks, Tom. It feels quite a sort of schizophrenic position for you to be in, because on one hand you've got some critics saying that they're concerned about this kind of regulatory mission creep of the role of the regulator, but on the other hand you've got others saying that the regulator won't have enough teeth to be able to tackle some of the well-documented issues. How do you see yourself navigating that path between those two really quite conflicting views of how the regulator will pan out?
Well, I think let's talk about teeth. I mean, actually, I think the regulator has got quite a lot of teeth in this. I think this is a bill which, as I keep saying, lays out a number of things the regulator has to do. It has the power to intervene in the final instance in a whole series of things, of owners and directors tests on if it has to, and if clubs activated the backstop, which we haven't talked about, and you may or may not wish to do so. But actually, I'm comfortable about the fact that the regulator has got enough authority and enough control within what is laid out in the bill to be able to do its job effectively. And if I didn't think that, I wouldn't do it. In terms of what everybody's asking us to do in the mission creep, I mean, I think part of that is an open discussion about, and not for today because we're creating this thing from scratch, but potentially over the number of years ahead, secretaries of state who've got responsibility for this bill and for the regulator going forward may well decide that other things need to be included within its remit, but that's far too early to tell now. So I'm not sure it is a schizophrenic position. I think it's a consequence of people wanting the regulator to do things. We talked about, as you saw in the debate, the incredibly important speeches about things like dementia in football, which we all feel very, very strongly about. That is not within the purview of the regulator. People talk about women's football being included. Obviously, women's football is a subject I know a fairly high amount about, not included within the purview. Who's to say what will happen in the future? At the moment, there's more than enough work to be done, and I think there's enough regulatory teeth in this, in the final instance, for us to be able to act. But as I said to Mr. Alba, I think actually the best regulator is the regulator you actually hear about least.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I asked that question is because in your questionnaire, when asked about the risks you think the regulator will face over its time in office, two of the risks you highlight, one was the reduction in media revenues and the other was the impact of other international competitions. They're not directly linked to the role of the regulator. So
Misunderstood. Yes, certainly. I was trying to answer the question about, and I haven't, in the vast amount of paper I have in front of me, of course, I've managed to put the questionnaire right at the bottom, so I won't reach for it now. But the fact is, when we are looking at the future analysis of where football is going, what are the risks for football as opposed to for a regulator, one of the things you know about in football is there are the known unknowns and there are the unknown unknowns. So at the moment, the EFL has done a remarkable job, far better than I ever did, I have to say, of getting 960 odd million from Sky for its media rights over the next 4 years, including I think it's 40 million for marketing, far greater sum than I was ever able to get for it. In the world of media, in the world of football finance, those media revenues, which are dramatically high, may over the course of time not be as high. You know, when you look at the media industry now and the way it's actually responding to media rights, one of the key components of the success of English football has been the money coming in from sale of media rights, obviously something I've been heavily involved in. What I was trying to highlight was, in the future, though we would have no responsibility whatsoever in the regulator for media rights, the consequence of that money not happening leads you to the questions of sustainability, which then leads you directly into the purview of the regulator. So there are consequential set of effects that we have to take account of. And when we get to the State of Game report, I'm assuming that not only will we be describing, you know, the state of game today, what part of the role of the State of Game report needs to be doing some analysis of what's going to potentially are the risks going forward, because those risks go to the point about sustainability and accountability. That's what I was trying to do.
okay, that's helpful. Thank you for clarifying. Let's move on to Rupa.
Hi, David. Interesting that you said that this regulator is sort of light touch and lightweight in some respects. I just wondered, what do you think that the main challenges are facing the football industry over the next 10 years? And are you satisfied that this football governance bill does everything it can to manage these challenges?
Well, I think 10 years in football, if a week is a long time in politics, 10 years in the world of football is sort of dog years. I mean, you know, who can tell? I think there are, as I tried to allude to in my questionnaire answer, I mean, I think there are things when you look at the wider ecology of football, it's constantly changing. It's constantly changing in terms of the nature of owners, it's constantly changing in terms of the financing of it, it's constantly changing in terms of risk, it's constantly changing in terms of litigation, actually. So all of those are, if you were looking at this as a normal business and you were doing a sort of risk assessment, you'd be building all of these in as risk. Part of the other issue is, as the chair just alluded to in one of my answers, you know, when you look at the way FIFA is now doing, you know, its World Club competition, the way UEFA has been developing its European competition, all of those are factors that have a direct impact on the English football, and things like broadcasting slots and on broadcasting financing. So all of those are risk factors, or indeed there are factors that have to be taken into an account of the future sustainability of English football. And I think we are, at the regulator, we have the ability to make judgments on those when it comes to the State of Game report, and no doubt in the public consultation, lots of people in football will have views on all those subjects. How much today we can get involved in any of those things, actually our powers to do so are pretty restricted in doing so. It is. I don't particularly like the term light touch, but I think what we are is very specific in terms of our remit here. We're very specific in terms of things we are able to get involved in, and and everything else we really can't. Now, whether that in the future is something that ministers and secretaries of state will think is still appropriate is really a matter for them. But as we start today, building this from scratch, I think we have sort of enough to be getting on with, really.
That you're very knowledgeable on women's football, obviously, and there's provisions in this bill that the Secretary of State could include it in the regulator's remit down the line. Do you think it should have been included now at this stage?
I'm going to give you a well-rehearsed answer on this, which is clearly my role today is to talk about what's in it rather than what's not in it. And clearly the Secretary of State was relying on the Carney report, which actually said it shouldn't be in it, and that is the position that we're in today.
I mean, given that many women's clubs are financially dependent on the financial management of men's clubs, do you think, what impact do you think not including women's football will have on their finances?
I really don't think I can talk about the future financing of women's football in this forum when I'm here as the potential chair of the football regulator. It's really not part of my purview.
I mean, you talked about sustainability. Without a clear mandate to monitor and sanction clubs for financial fair play breaches, there's many people sort of questioning the actual impact on that. Would you agree with them?
No, I wouldn't. I mean, clearly the regulator is not involved in competition issues, and of those competition issues, the PSR within the Premier League is clearly a matter for the Premier League and the matter of the way it works with its own clubs. It's not part of the purview of the regulator. What is part of the purview of the regulator is the consequential effect of whatever action the Premier League is taking over PSR. And as we've seen with a number of clubs over the last 2 or 3 years, if the actions that the Premier League is taking have a direct bearing on the financial resilience and stability of individual clubs, that then falls into exactly the purview of the regulator. But we're not there to be involved in competition issues, and those competition issues have been declared on as PSR, financial fair play, and it's not part of what we're able to do.
I mean, sort of case study example, Reading, and Damien Green, who used to be on this committee, was a mad Reading fan, used to go on about it all the time. So the ex-owners, Dai Young and Dai Zhu Li, took over when it was near the top of the championship in 2017, but by 2021, Reading FC was spending over 200% of its annual revenue on player wages, so, you know, not the antithesis of sustainability. What role do you think that this regulator should have in ensuring spending, and would it be able to step in if an owner goes bad halfway through, if another Reading situation occurs?
I mean, as it happens, Damien Green is somebody I've known for over 50 years. And one of the MPs currently involved in the whole Reading dispute is somebody who I've talked to frequently about what's going on at Reading. And I think that if the regulator had existed some years ago, before the Reading issue was coming up, what you would have seen as part of the direct consequence of the work that we're able to do in licensing is a lot of the issues that have come up with Reading, a lot of the issues about the ownership of the ground, a lot of issues about the financing, a lot of issues about the nature of the owner, all of those would actually come up through the powers within the regulator. If you read the owners and directors test, which is far more extensive within the regulatory powers than it is within the EFL, which is why the EFL now has dropped its own owners and directors test and is going to take the regulator's owners and directors test, because we have access to much greater knowledge and much greater ability to intervene. If you look at the issues of ownership of grounds, where that is absolutely part of the heritage of clubs and the way in which the regulator can judge the heritage of clubs, all of those are tripwires that would have come up in any discussion of Reading if we'd existed 6, 7, 8 years ago, whenever the first Reading issues came up. But of course now, you know, it's no longer an issue for us, it's an issue for the EFL board, as I understand they're currently dealing with it, and I don't have insight into that.
When 2 months ago EFL said that Young had failed their owners and directors, and they threatened him with expulsion, but then sort of nothing's actually happened. I guess someone's waiting for a sale to take place. In the event that an owner fails the fit and proper test, are you confident that this regulator would have the power to force people to sell shares, to force it?
Well, we don't necessarily have the power to get people to sell shares. What we do have the power to do is to investigate and to ask clubs and owners, indeed, both to meet our test of owners and directors test, and also to then give us the details of what they're actually doing with the club, which will then allow us to act. In the case of Reading, I mean, clearly I don't know what discussions have taken place within the EFL board. I mean, there's all sorts of speculation, as far as I understand it, that the previous owner of Wickham may be a potential buyer, but this is not an issue for me and not an issue on which I'm particularly well informed. But the truth is that the whole premise of the work that the regulator can do within this bill is you start off with a licensing regime which gives you the basis of knowledge, which gives you the basis of risk assessment, which then allows you to get involved in a whole series of issues to do with the way the clubs are planning their future, and at the same time allows you to assess owners and directors in terms of all sorts of provisions, in terms of knowledge we can get from things like the National Crime Agency and their actions overseas and all sorts of other stuff. We will have knowledge that actually I don't believe the football authorities have really had access to, and that allows you to take a judgment about what you then can do, and that ultimately we have the power of intervention.
So what, taking over a club temporarily?
I can't specify what intervention might mean because, you know, we haven't set up the system yet.
Okay, I mean, I think these things should be addressed to stop people saying that it's toothless and pointless.
Well, I think since it doesn't exist yet, I can understand why people might believe it might be toothless and pointless.
Now is the time.
But actually, what I would say is we have a very clear roadmap within this bill that allows us to define pretty clearly what we're going to start off by doing, and I have no doubt that others will then review if we ever have to get involved in stuff, we will get involved, whether we've been effective or not. My view is that we will be effective, but I'm hoping we never have to be. I mean, you would expect me to say that. But at the moment, we are starting off with a pretty much clean slate of paper because the regulator hasn't existed, and what you've relied on are the boards of the different leagues to deal with their own individual clubs, either through competition issues or through ownership issues. And clearly, by the very nature of the Crouch report and what's happened since, there is now felt to be a need for a regulator who can take greater, more effective action. But that is not something that I'm sitting here prejudging when I haven't even got involved in knowing what the regulator's process is going to be, because I'm not in place yet.
Just a tiny little bit on fans. Countries like Germany have rules that ensure that they're represented at executively level, you know, they're on the board and stuff. Mm-hmm. So they have a proper say in decision making. Is that a model that you'd like to see adopted?
Well, it's interesting that the sections of this bill that relate to fans, which I'm sure you'll know, are actually quite interesting because what they do is, I think pretty much for the first time, give fans an absolute right for owners of clubs to regularly, and I do think the key word here is regularly, get involved in a whole series of issues that affect fans within their clubs. And those are issues about ticket pricing, they're about the ability of the owners to get involved in the heritage of the clubs, but they're also about the business of the club and the way the club moves forward. So that's the first time that fans have been given the backing to be given information about their own clubs, which allows them to take a judgment call. And I think actually that is a pretty remarkable step forward, backed by a regulator who is going to ensure that clubs are under that sort of level of assessment. I haven't got a view as to what that may lead to over the future in terms of individual clubs wishing to appoint fans to their boards or anything else. It's not part of the statutory powers of the regulator, though.
I'm pleased you talked about ticket prices because I've got my private members bill going through. So you would work to ensure that there's fairness for fans in
It is not a matter for the regulator to set ticket prices for individual clubs. It is a matter for the regulator to allow fans to have a view on those ticket prices. That's what the regulator is there to do. I have no power to intervene on ticket prices. I have a power. The regulator will have a power. It's not my personal power, clearly. The regulator has the authority to get involved in sustainability and financing of clubs. Part of that review will be the way in which ticket prices are being applied, but we have absolutely no ability to affect a club and the way in which it charges for its tickets.
Last thing. Todd Bowley of Chelsea. It's turned out that he's a major, he's on the board and has a major financial interest in Vivid Seats, which is a ticket reselling site that's pretty extortionate and rips off fans. Is that a conflict of interest, would you say?
I'm afraid I'm just not across the detail and I can't really answer that question. I don't know.
Okay, quite often they say we'll get back to you, but I suppose you're not in post yet, so...
Oh, I'm merely the preferred candidate. I have no status whatsoever.
As the preferred candidate, can I just take you back to Chelsea for a sec? The Premier League cleared Chelsea FC for the sale of 2 hotels to a sister company, which kept them compliant with the profit and sustainability rules. The profit and sustainability rules as enacted by the Premier League at the moment is just not fit for purpose, is it?
I'm afraid not a matter for the regulator and I can't really comment on it.
But You must have an opinion. I mean, as a football fan, as someone who's clearly got a lot of knowledge and understanding of the game, it may not come under the purview of the regulator, but clearly, you've got an opinion on this.
Part of the thing I have learnt in the last few weeks is having opinions, having any sort of involvement in any opinions or political opinions about football are a dangerous thing when you're applying for this sort of role. And I'm afraid in terms of this interview and in terms of this meeting, you're interviewing me as chair of the regulator, not as David Kogan. And whatever opinions I might have, I'm going to allow to sit over there while I sit in front of you as a prospective chair of the regulator who has no involvement whatsoever in PSR.
The clues in the title, profit and sustainability rules. I mean, under the remit of the regulator is the sustainability of football.
Yes.
So you still don't have an opinion on that basis?
Well, I mean, I have an opinion on the sustainability of clubs, which will come out of objective licensing rules that we're going to put on those clubs, which will allow us to understand whether clubs are in fact sustainable. That's entirely different from the Premier League's rules, PSR rules, which are about competition between clubs. They're actually about competitiveness between clubs than they are about sustainability. And as I say, I think one thing leads to the other. If there are clubs that fall foul of the PSR rules for whatever reason, and that has an impact on their ability to be sustainable entities going forward, then it becomes a matter for the regulator, which will come out of the licensing regime. But in terms of what's provoked that, which is the PSR rules, we have no opinion on that.
You don't have an opinion on how this would impact their spend, their capacity for spend, and in fact, whether or not this kind of what you might call creative accounting is acceptable.
I mean, clearly, Chair, you have an opinion on this, and you're able to give that opinion, but I don't believe I am as Chair of the regulator, given that this is not part of my future remit.
That's interesting. Thank you. Let's have you, Paul.
What's certainly central to your remit is obviously the financial resilience of English football. That's the whole purpose of this regulator. That's why up until recently there was being cross-party support for this initiative, because everyone can see that football is not just a sense of local pride, it's also an economic powerhouse, it's also a community asset. And so given that the financial resilience piece is central to your job, obviously we referred to the parachute payments. They're central to a lot of the debate about fairness or lack of it within football. What's really interesting, surely, and is obvious, is that there is no real pyramid at the moment. In many ways, it's almost like a skyscraper with the lower league clubs at the bottom, basically having very, very little access right to the top with the penthouse suites. I have to say that what's central to that is the parachute payment problem. The total broadcasting deal at the moment is worth 3.2 billion. Of that, 88% goes to Premier League clubs and 7% to clubs in receipt of parachute payments. The remaining 5% split between the next 138 clubs. And what really is stark is that financially the one first-year parachute payment, about £50 million, is worth more than the current media distribution deal for all the clubs in League One, League Two, National League North and National League South. So one club gets more than 120 clubs. You obviously have concerns about that, whether they're private or public, but are you pleased that at least parachute payments are now integral to the bill?
I am. And I am for a number of reasons, but the main reason is this. When you're being asked to do a stated game report and you're trying to do an analysis of the kind of ecosystem and the econometrics behind that ecosystem, clearly the parachute payment issue is one, as you've just highlighted, which has a very significant impact. You can't really do an analysis on the overall state of football that holds any water at all unless you're including the parachute payments. When you look at the deal that was done in 2019, you look at the 1.6 billion that the Premier League talks about, distributing throughout the world of football. One can break those numbers down into a different set of component parts, and they're all absolutely relevant. They're also relevant, I assume, to any future relationship between the Premier League and the EFL over any future distribution arrangements. So you absolutely have to include them as part of the analysis. Now, what conclusion you reach from that analysis is too early to tell, because, as I said, it was very telling and interesting re-watching the Select Committee from 16 months ago, where I had forgotten, I watched it live at the time, mainly because of women's football, actually. I watched it, but actually what I'd forgotten was just how much detail both Mr Parry and Mr Masters had obviously gone into to potentially get to close to a deal. I mean, it's quite clear, you know, they talked about percentages of monies being distributed. There are specific percentages being mentioned. And here we are 16 months later, and at the time the chair was clearly showing signs of frustration with them. It was quite evident there. I think there's got to be in some way a sensible discussion. You've got to include parachute payments within that.
And do you think it will be a key test of the success of the regulator, whether or not those parachute payments, there is a deal in the next few years?
No, because I mean, as you know, the way that the backstop, which is the ultimate sanction, the way the backstop has been created is actually initiated by the leagues. It's not initiated by the regulator. There is a whole ornate structure of how a mediator is brought in, how an external committee is appointed, and how ultimately the constituent leagues who are involved in not agreeing have to both put forward their positions, which is then decided in a completely binary way. The regulator actually in some ways has quite little to do with that, apart from creating the structure of getting you to those two binary proposals. My absolute hope is, I mean, people talk about the nuclear option of the backstop. Actually, I prefer to think of it more of a sort of tactical weapon. You don't use nuclear options because if you do, well, you will die. You can use tactical weapons. I think the backstop is a tactical weapon, but it's one that I absolutely would urge the world of football not to invoke. We have got time, and I would just remind you of this because I don't think people have realised this. You can't essentially enact the backstop until the state of game report has been produced and written and consulted on. There is an 18-month window in which to do that. Actually, in reality, it's probably shorter than that because you have to go out for public consultation. There is probably, therefore, from the moment we are commissioned in the secondary legislation, there is probably at least a year where there is time for the world of football to agree among itself. And the more they agree among themselves, and the less we have to be involved, I think the better. But clearly, you know, we will see where we get to.
Thank you. I think the clubs will receive that message loud and clear that you've set the clock ticking.
The legislation has set the clock ticking.
Yeah, sure, but you've underlined that the legislation is doing that. Just finally, people often suggest, what do we want? Do we want what's more important, a competitive Premier League or a more fair pyramid? Do you think those two can go hand in hand, or is there a real inherent contradiction with those two things?
I believe they absolutely can go hand in hand.
Right. Thank you.
Is there any way you'd like to change the bill?
I'm very happy to accept the bill as it's been produced, and obviously I believe it. I'm not an expert on parliamentary process, but I understand it's going to a committee stage where presumably there may be other amendments made to it. But my job is to take what has been done and to apply it, and that's what I intend to do.
There are no amendments that you'd like to see?
I don't have an opinion. I not being a parliamentarian and not having been involved in the process of creating the bill, I don't think it'd be appropriate for me to come up with stuff on the fly.
I expected you to have a lot more opinions today.
Thank you. You mentioned your commitment to the parachute payments, which is welcome. And we understand your sort of priorities, obviously, ensuring the pyramid is stable and it's set up the right way. So, which again is welcome. I suppose my question to you is, we have 10 tiers of football in this country. I'm not saying you oversee all of them, but there is an ecosystem that's really important. Sometimes that's lost, even with regards to the progression of players out of youth clubs down into the pyramid, coaching staff, players going up and down. So sometimes I feel that's lost. And so what I wanted to ask you is, do you see, and I'm mindful of the term, you know, we spoke about mission creep as well, so I'm mindful of that. You can't take everything on with this role. But what I wanted to ask is, do you see a way where you can sort of maintain a sort of meaningful and a collaborative relationship with the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th and 10th tiers of the football system and their management?
Well, I'd hope so, but actually, in all honesty, I think it's going to be quite a big job keeping open, collaborative and sensible relationships with the 5 tiers of English football that are within my purview. I mean, it's 116 clubs, all of whom obviously are going to have an opinion about regulator and obviously have an opinion about the work that we're doing. But I actually, again, I would come back to one of the things that's interesting about the legislation is that it includes in it the provision that one can create advisory committees beyond the board. And I think one of the things we need to look at is how do we include wider football voices within the role of the regulator to give us advice as to what we're missing. Part of the job of setting anything up that's new is not what you know, it's what you don't know, it's what you're missing. So I think that creating mechanisms by which we are getting that sort of relationship with numerous tiers in football is pretty important. But to be absolutely honest with you, I think getting the 116 first is going to be a reasonably heavy task, and the sooner we can start it, the better.
Last but not least, Steri.
Thank you. So good morning. And
Morning.
You touched on, in the very opening remarks, the importance of football to the country. And of course, central to that is all of the fans up and down the country for whom, their passionate following of football clubs is crucial. And the economic impact. So it feels right and proper to end the session talking about the fans. And my first question is, do you think the Premier League and the EFL sufficiently have enforced existing rules around fan engagement? Because there has been a lot of conversation about how fans should be more involved with their clubs and football.
Well, obviously individual clubs have had individual relationships with fans, and they have supporters' trusts, and there are all sorts of ways in which different clubs have interacted with fans. But what there hasn't been is a consistent application of fans' voices within the way in which clubs are developed going forward and the rest of it. And that's exactly what this legislation allows fans to be able to do. So although there has been a series of relationships between clubs and their fans, depending on the club and the rest of it, it really has depended not just on the clubs but on individual owners as to how much they're prepared to engage and how much they're prepared to listen. And I think that we can all agree has been a pretty variable picture. One of the things about the regulator is we're going to bring, I hope we'll bring consistency and support to making this a much more stable and regularised process. And individual fans will believe and feel that they have an ally in the regulator, because that's the whole premise on which the regulator was started in the first place by Dame Tracy 4 years ago.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And one of the things that I think is there is still sitting there as a concern is that how can you as regulator ensure that consultations and engagements which involve fans, as you rightly pointed out, are stipulated in the bill, are meaningful? Then they're not just clubs appointing a set of fans that they think will give the answer that they want to hear.
Well, I think it's quite difficult for anybody to intervene with a club in terms of the fans they're appointing. I mean, if a club is actually appointing fans into board positions or into advisory positions within it, then actually that's a very good first step. I don't think it's really for the regulator to say that's the right fan, that's the wrong fan. I think what we've got to do is create the process by which that fan engagement is reinforced. And actually the legislation does that. There are a whole series of things that the fans have got a right to ask questions about. We haven't mentioned DI in this conversation yet, but I mean there are a whole series of ways in which the regulator has the authority and power to look at what clubs are doing and to highlight their failures and to highlight and indeed to publicise when clubs are not carrying out both fan engagement and issues that come out of DI and all the rest of it. I mean, that is within our authority. And I think part of that is holding clubs to some degree of account. But actually, I think quite a lot of it will be having fans much more reinforced in their relationship with the clubs, and we will then know what is going on. And I think that's actually a big step forward. At the moment, a lot of this, I mean, we talk about Reading, we talk about other clubs, a lot of this is all shrouded in mystery. Transparency in football has been a fairly unusual kind of application. I think part of what we're here to do is be that transparent force.
Thank you. And we've touched at various points in the conversation today around the fact that football grounds and clubs are are community assets. And we've also talked quite a lot about Reading, but I'm going to go back to the story of Reading, because as part of attempting to aid cash flow, they put the stadium up as collateral against a £50 million loan, and that has made it very difficult to sell the club. What formal role do you think fans should play in these decisions behind key community assets such as this? And because they are the cornerstones of the communities that football clubs represent.
I think an absolutely critical role. I think, part of what we've seen, the first sign of difficulty, actually, when you look back on the history of clubs that have got into trouble, is when an owner removes the key asset of the club, be it the stadium or be it the training ground, removes it from the ambit of the club and places it in a different vehicle, financial vehicle, and suddenly what you have is a fragmentation of what is essentially the key infrastructure of the club. Now, in some cases, that works perfectly well, and I think that you get, the owners of the stadium and the owners of the clubs are able to work side by side. The fans are satisfied and the rest of it, but actually often it's the first sign that there is some degree of use of an asset that may not be necessary to the benefit of the fans and the benefit of the club as a whole. And that is an indicator that we are going to be able to pick up through the legislation and through our ability to license. It's also something that the fans themselves within the legislation have the ability to question. It's part of the heritage role, one of the three key indicators of what this regulator is about, is protecting club heritage. Well, there's nothing greater in club heritage than sensible decisions about grounds being either held by the club or being transferred out of the club and being replaced. So I think it's a critical factor that we need to be fully accountable for.
Thank you. And can I ask just one final question, which is about really what you see as the regulator, your relationship being with fan organisations, because you talked a lot about fans in relation to their clubs, but I'm interested in having that. What's your perspective of the overarching picture? Well,
part of the conversation I was having with Mr Miles the other day is exactly that question. And I said to him, what is it that the FSA, and there are other national fans organisations, what is it you require from us so you feel that you are getting input directly into the heart of the regulator as we're creating policy and as we're creating strategy? And I'm absolutely open to those discussions from day one to actually understand how we do it. And as I say, there are different mechanisms that we're going to look at. One might be an advisory committee, one might be actually within the board of the regulator having a representative of fan organisations on that. But at the moment, I can't comment on it because, one, I don't know who's applied to be on the board, because I don't. And secondly, I'm not in place. But I think it would be completely absurd to have gone through all of this from the day that Dame Tracy Crouch created her committee, fan-led review, not ultimately to end up with fans at the heart of the outcome of that fan-led review. And we need to figure out what the mechanisms are, but I haven't got actually the position to do that yet.
Thanks, Zoe. Bye.
Excuse me, sorry.
Thank you. Just following on from that, regarding sort of fan engagement, so with regards to Southend, we had a situation where the previous owner pretty much wanted to sort of move the club and the stadium away, which would have put the club in a much more sort of perilous financial situation. The new owners, COSU, the Southend Council and the Shrimpers Trust did quite a lot to sort of unpick a very sort of complex web of deals effectively, which to help save the club. So my question really is, as the regulator, what message would you send to fans, to significant stakeholders in all these communities, that 116 different communities affected by these football clubs? What message would you send as the potential football regulator?
In terms of stadia or in general?
Stadia and general.
I would say that the regulator has been created out of a fan-led review because despite the extraordinary growth and success of English football, there are clearly, as part of actually that success and growth, as the success and growth has taken place, so there have been exposures in the resilience and support of clubs throughout the pyramid, or indeed, as Mr Wall referred to it, throughout the skyscraper. And the regulator is there with the powers it's been given for fans, and it's got 3 key criteria that apply to the regulator in terms of financial resilience, in terms of financial knowledge, in terms of heritage of clubs. All of those are at the heart of the mission we have, which is to improve resilience and to improve our knowledge of what is actually going on. And I would say to fans, I would say to owners of clubs, I would say to the managers of leagues, that the regulator is there not as a cop, it's there to help. It is there as an asset as well, but ultimately we're going to act to the benefit of football and to the benefit of those very fans to keep this pyramid going. It is a remarkable achievement. English football is a remarkable achievement. English football over the last 150 years has managed to get through a significant series of changes, even in the last 20 or 30 years. Change is great, change is growth, but it's also change is potentially dangerous unless it's managed properly, and I think we're there to help manage it properly.
Brilliant. I think the community in Southend will look forward to you coming down to Roots Hall.
I very much look forward to seeing you there.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Bio. So we're pretty much through our formal questions. I guess we're now into extra time, so my job is just to ask a couple of housekeeping questions. So in your questionnaire, when asked if you intend to fulfil your 5-year term and seek reappointment, you said, yes, I would hope so, but 5 years is a long time in football. I think you've repeated that again today. Have you got your eye on anything else?
Anything else?
Any other job? I mean, is it... okay, so just
I have, as I said in my questionnaire, continuing relationship with CNN, a continuing relationship with the New York Times, because actually I think issues of intellectual property and AI are of unbelievable importance. But I'm giving up my relationship with the Women's Sports Group, which I co-founded, because clearly that's involved in football matters, which you can't do when you're the regulator, and that's it.
In the papers we received from DCMS and your questionnaire, you note that you have donated to local Labour Party candidates, and today you've fleshed that out a little bit by telling us that you donated to the leadership campaigns of the Prime Minister and the Culture Secretary, the 2 ministers involved in your appointment. So before we finish, and we will now go into a private session and consider our report, is there anything that you haven't told us or DCMS that you would like to put on the record now so that we find it out from you rather than from the newspaper?
No.
Okay, and finally, if we did decide that you weren't suitable for this job, would you still take it?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mr Kogan. It's been a great pleasure to meet you today. Thank you for answering all of our questions, and we are now going to go into a private session, so I will ask everyone else to leave the room. Thank you very much. Order.